Good morning to those here in the United States. Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. My name is Johan Fleck. I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Europe Center's kickoff event of our Germany Votes, the Superwahljahr Series. As the German speakers here may know, it's a Superwahljahr in Germany. On September 26, Germans across the country will head to the polls and vote for a new Bundestag and a new government. We will discuss in a moment why this year's elections matter especially and why we should be paying attention. But all of you will know that for the first time in 16 years and 4 elections, Chancellor Angela Merkel's name will not be on the ballot. So this election will mark more than the usual political contest and leadership change for Europe's largest power and its role in the world as Chancellor Merkel steps down. For the first time in Germany's post-war history, there's no incumbent up for re-election, and the election campaign is more open-ended than many might have thought even just a few weeks ago. And this vote comes against the backdrop of a dramatically changed geopolitical environment for Germany, a divided European Union, a fallout from the pandemic, and a more fragmented political landscape at home compared to when Chancellor Merkel first entered office. Given the significance of the upcoming elections for Germany and its international role, the Europe Center is proud to embark on our Superwahljahr series. Throughout the campaign and subsequent coalition talks, we will host events, publish analysis, and provide interview experts to discuss the German elections and their implications. I hope you will stay tuned over the coming weeks for our public events, articles, and Twitter debriefs, and you will follow along using the hashtag #GermanyVotes. And today, to kick us off, we're happy to have 2 of the most eminent Germany watchers and experts with us to get an update on what's happened so far in the campaign and what the biggest implications of this election will be for Germany and its role in Europe and the world. Now, without further ado, let me hand it over to our moderator, Ines Pohl, the Washington Bureau Chief for Deutsche Welle, to get us started. Dankeschön for joining us, and Ines, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for having me, and I'm really thrilled to moderate the first panel in this exciting last weeks before this really outstanding election. I'm very happy to meet Dr. Constanze Stelzmüller again, virtually at least. She's the Senior Fellow of the Center of the United States and Europe and the first Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institute. Hello, Constanze, great having you this morning. And I'm also thrilled to discuss this most important topic with Tyson Barker. He is the Head of Technology of Global Affairs Program at the German Council on Foreign Relationships, also known as DGAP. Constanze, let me start with you, maybe to give our American audience a little bit of a perspective on the differences between the 2 systems, the American system and the German system, and what that means for the election campaigning.
You're asking me to explain the German election system? I think our whole session lasts only 45 minutes.
No, just the differences.
We have the time. I'm joking, Ines, don't worry.
Cool.
But that said, this is a question that strikes terror in my heart because there are all these aspects of the German election system that I would find difficult to explain in German, never mind in English, such as the Überhangmandat, the ultimate size of the Bundestag. But basically, the bottom line is we have a parliamentary system, not a presidential system. People have 2 votes. They vote for direct candidates in where they live, and they vote for the party lists. And depending on where candidates are on the party lists and the percentage that their party then garners in the election, they stand a chance of entering into the Bundestag and being considered for a position if their party enters a governing coalition, being considered for a position in the government. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes, I think it's also important to understand that as Germany has more than two parties, which is true for the United States, every party is forced to build a coalition. That forces parties also into
Yes.
compromises. Tyson, maybe you can talk a little bit what that means for the election campaigning.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. What Constanza described makes the parties themselves much more important. So in the United States, we have a kind of free agent system where every member of Congress is directly elected. But in the German system, many are elected by virtue of the fact that they're members of parties. So that means that party positions, the factions themselves are quite important. And whereas in the United States, we have two sides of the aisle, in Germany, you have seven sides of the aisle, which is a great range of parties. The two traditional big parties, the big tent parties, they call them the Volksparteien, are the Christian Democrats. That's Merkel's party. It's a center-right party, traditionally Catholic. It's a West German party, which has governed Germany as a lead party for most of its post-war history. And the center-right, and the center-left, Social Democratic Party, Germany's oldest party, with its roots in the labor movement. So those are the two big parties. And then in the middle, you have something called the Free Democrats, or the liberals. And it's more of a free market, social libertarian party, which has also existed for most of Germany's post-war history. In the meantime, we have three new parties. First, the Green Party, which arose in the late 70s and early 80s out of the environmental movement and protests against the deployment of nuclear weapons in Germany. We have Die Linke, the left party, which has developed around the former Rump East German Communist Party, but has some strongholds as well in West Germany. And then the most recent addition, of course, is the Alternative for Germany, which is a kind of reactionary party, originally focused around Euroscepticism, a reaction to the Eurozone crisis, and Germany's role in essentially creating stabilizers within the Eurozone, but has moved to be a much more anti-immigrant party and represents a lot of the same kind of tendencies that we see in Donald Trump's base in the United States in some ways. So those are the seven parties that we'll see in this next parliament. Okay,
cool, Tyson. So that's many parties, obviously. And you mentioned the former, I shall say, Volksparteien. There used to be really big 10 parties. They really used to have like 30% or so of the votes, and this has dramatically changed. Even 40, exactly. Maybe, Constanze, you can walk us a little bit through the current situation and why it is so crowded in the middle, and maybe if that has something to do with these many years of Chancellor Merkel.
Yes, all right, thank you. This has been the most whiplash-inducing election of my adult lifetime, I have to say. I've never seen anything like it. With the fortunes of, the fact that we have three candidates for chancellor. We've never had that before. In the entire history of Germany since 1949, the recreation of at that time, two German republics, the communist and the Western, we've always had two chancellor candidates fielded by the CDU and the SPD, the conservatives, and the as it were, the German version of the Labour Party. Now the Greens, for the first time in history, are fielding their own candidate. And memorably, for quite a while at the beginning of this campaign, it looked as though their candidate, Annalena Baerbock, actually had a serious chance of winning. Right now, she has fallen back in the polls. For a while, it looked as though a CDU win, with the CDU's somewhat colorless candidate, Armin Laschet, was the inevitable winner because they were frontrunners in the polls. But again, Armin Laschet has fallen back in ways unimaginable compared with sort of previous CDU history. I think that Angela Merkel's last election win was based on a 36% of the vote. And Laschet is heading into minus 20% percentage points of the polls, which by CDU standards is just earth-shattering. The other thing we should maybe explain that we didn't explain at the beginning, Tyson and I, is that the German election, the German parliament has a 5% threshold, meaning that if you don't garner more, you can sign up, you can register as a party to run, but if you don't garner more than 5% of the votes, then you are not going to enter. However, there are enough tiny splinter parties, weird splinter parties, and we won't waste any time discussing all of them. But for them to garner a total of something like 5%, maybe 6% of the overall vote, meaning that the party that wins doesn't have to have 50% of the vote, or the coalition that wins, it can be a little bit less, somewhere around 45, 46%. And the situation that we have now for the first time since 1998 is what the Germans call Wechselstimmung, which is a change mood, where suddenly the leader of the Social Democrats, Olaf Scholz, is out front. Not just with his party running neck to neck with others, but he as candidate, the obvious favorite in all the surveys where people are asked, whom would you prefer as candidate? That is making these last not quite 4 weeks of this election campaign so special and so nerve-wracking for everybody, including presumably for him.
Thank you. That was a very, I think, important explanation, Tyson. Maybe we should stick a couple more minutes within Germany. Could you map out the biggest distinctions between the three big, let's say the four parties, CDU, CSU, the Union, the SPD, the Green Party, and the FDP, when it comes to domestic policy? We will go to international, to foreign policy, but just to give our viewers an idea, who is going to vote for whom, and is there this kind of traditional distinction anymore? And again, maybe Angela Merkel kind of leveled that out. That would be my question to you, if you agree on that.
Well, your question, especially in part, was very perceptive, because what you basically said is that there has been a blurring of the lines, particularly between the two big parties. There has been an attempt, and Merkel, in the Merkel era, has been very adept at creating a kind of nebulous center around her and her type of consensus building, which has essentially governed Germany with one slight break for her entire reign. With these grand coalitions. And the truth is, I agree with Constanze, we're looking probably at another chancellor and maybe even another lead party if we're looking at the polls today. But I wonder if there's really that Wechselstimmung, especially when you look at voters over 60. Merkel is still the most popular politician in Germany by far. And if you read the kind of intentions of voters right now, two politicians are really trying to lay the claim to her legitimacy as successor. One is the man from her party, and the other is the man from her government. And they're both saying, we are the stewards of continuity from the Merkel era into the next era. Exactly. Which was made clear in subtle and not so subtle ways in the debate over the weekend. But, you know, if you look at a party like the SPD, which is a very interesting party, this is a party that since 1998 has been in government for 17 of the past 21 years. It's really a party of government. And although its traditions are rooted in the labor movement, it has become, its base voter has become much more associated with civil servants. So there's a much greater attachment, at least among its broad voters, maybe not among party activists, with stability, with the Merkel era, which they see as pretty validating. After the last election, of course, there was a major drop in support for the SPD because they brought in a candidate from outside, Martin Schulz. They were trying to create this Wechselstimmung, and they were not rewarded at the polls. And the assumption was they needed to spend some time in the wilderness and basically recharge their ideas. And when Olaf Scholz ran for party chairman, he lost, precisely because he was seen as a representative of the status quo. But now going into this election, he looks on track to become the next chancellor. And I think he's going to be the one who lifts his party into government again. So that's one point that's interesting to watch. In that sense, I think the distinctions between the parties aren't maybe necessarily between the SPD and CDU, but more with the Greens and the Liberals, which do have very specific political identities. You can also see that in the type of voters who want to vote for them. They're the ones who have Wechselstimmung. And if you look at the polling, the demography, their voters tend to be younger on both sides. Voters in Germany under 29, if they had their choice, around 35% would be voting for the Greens. So they would be a Volkspartei for voters under 30. And around 23% would be voting for the FDP. For the big Volksparteien, it's around 11% each. So there is an intergenerational dimension to this, and that also involves the AfD. I want to mention one more thing before we move on to other aspects. The role of mail-in voting. This is a campaign that has really taken a page from the United States, from other countries in the COVID crisis, and promoted mail-in voting as an alternative for going to the polls on Sunday, the 26th. And for that reason, voting day has already begun. So a lot of what we are seeing happen right now in perception, there's going to be movement between now and election day, but a lot of it is being set in stone or in Stein gemeißelt right as we're speaking. And some of the parties that have been promoting mail-in voting most heavily have been the Greens and the SPD. So it'll be interesting to see how that voter turnout, that marginal increase in voter turnout, which is already quite high in Germany, is reflected on polling day. On the AfD, it's also interesting to point out that they've already started to question the integrity of mail-in voting.
Well, they're learning from the big. Thank you. I'll leave it there kind of before we move on to the next session when we focused on the differences when it comes to international affairs, when it comes to NATO involvement. I want to remind our viewers that you can participate in this conversation. We will give ourselves like 10 minutes or so at the end to discuss your questions, which you can leave in the chat. Constanze, let's talk about the four big parties and the differences in their foreign policy approaches. Let's start with the CDU.
Sure. Actually, I'm not going to start with that. I'm going to start with the fringes. I think if you look at the party programs and the pronouncements of Die Linke and the AfD, it's very clear that neither of those parties is within Germany's sort of post-war fundamental consensus of Atlanticism, pro-Europeanism, and pro-being in human rights pacts, international organizations, working with the United Nations, and so on. Both of them are notably pro-Russia. I think the AfD is still the only party to have a Russian translation of its party program on its website, which I do find impressive. Waiting for Chinese, I guess. If you look at the CDU, the SPD, and the Liberals and the Greens, you would have to say that the three older parties, all of them pay lip service to Atlanticism, Europeanism, multilateralism, but if you know if you know their political practice, if you have followed them for years, you know that all of them are somewhat split down the middle on many of these issues, and that in fact all three of these parties have, if you will, liberal hawks and nationalists who favor balancing between the West and the East, or between democracies and powerful authoritarians whose gas or whose trade we need. I say this because, in my view, somewhat unfairly, the Social Democrats, because of the egregious role of a certain former chancellor, who shall remain nameless, are presented as the party that wants Ostpolitik all the time and under all circumstances, and including with China. I think that's not quite true. Again, all the parties are split. The Greens are more overtly hawkish, interventionist, more firmly supportive of a liberal world order, but they too have balancers. They too have anti-Atlanticists, or even people who speak with a nationalist tinge. If you listen closely, you will find that. And I think the current debacle with the withdrawal and evacuation from Afghanistan is going to push to the fore some of these issues: the relationship with America, Europe's role in providing for its own security, and Europe's role in the world. And the next government is going to have some very complicated discussions on this. And by the way, the Social Democrats, if Olaf Scholz becomes chancellor, the Social Democrats have a very strong left wing, represented by the party leadership, Norbert Walter-Borjans and Saskia Esken, and most notably the party whip Ralf Mützenich, that I think differs on many of these issues with its chancellor candidate Olaf Scholz.
Tyson, how important are the takes on international relationships for the voter body in this specific election?
That's a great question. I mean, usually it's obviously of minimal importance. The importance in Germany, like any other country, are bread and butter issues. I will say that the first topic of the debate over the weekend was Afghanistan, which led into greater discussion around Germany's role, sufficient support for the Bundeswehr, the German military, reaching the 2%, Germany's role in NATO, and its Atlanticist orientation. So it did get a lot of attention, but it's still primarily domestically focused and somewhat insular. If you look at another topic, which was not in the news every day, which is the European Union and Germany's role in the European Union, the only person to mention the European Union explicitly was Olaf Scholz, and that was in the last 7-8 minutes of a 2-hour discussion. So that shows you how domestically contextualized this discussion is. What could make it a little more acute up in front is if the issue of migration becomes more prominent in the public discourse. But security and stabilization, Iraq, great power conflict, these are not the issues that are driving voters to the polls.
So then let's ask a little bit more provocative or more specific concerns. Why should an international audience care if it's a SPD chancellor or a CDU chancellor or a Green chancellor? Does this really matter?
You know what, I think the audience should care a little more about how long it will take us to actually form a government. That's right now, that's my greatest concern. Because the premise implied in your question, which is how much difference will it actually make, is correct. It's the CDU and the Social Democrats, of course, have differences, but really, compared to Die Linke or the AfD, they're not that far away from each other, and they're certainly quite far away, all of them, from the current positions of the majority of the GOP. But how do I put this? Remember in 2017, when Merkel ran again, it took 5 months for her to form a new government. She tried to negotiate a 3-way coalition for the first time with the Greens and the Liberals, and finally the Liberals walked out. And then the Social Democrats, who had prayed to be in opposition because they felt that they were being squeezed by Merkel's political triangulation of the CDU into the middle, following the models of Clinton and Tony Blair, Clinton in the 1990s, Tony Blair in the noughties, as they say. The Social Democrats did the responsible thing and came back into a third grand coalition with Merkel. The question right now is, because so many potential coalition models are in play, at least theoretically. I mean, some of them are a lot more theoretical than others. For example, red-red-green has come back into play. In other words, the Social Democrats, the Greens, and Die Linke. I don't think that's going to happen because the positions of Die Linke are just unpalatable for the SPD leadership, except for the very far left in the SPD. But what's in play definitely is a traffic light coalition, meaning Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals. Theoretically in play is a Germany coalition, CDU, SPD, and Liberals. I don't think that's going to happen the way the CDU is going right now. And then maybe Tyson will disagree, but I have a hard time seeing that at this point. And I think Jamaica, the CDU, Greens and Liberals, which seemed very likely for a while, right now seems a lot less likely because of the unfortunate trajectory of the CDU's candidate. So all that means that we are not going to be in the privileged position of German TV viewers of decades before, and certainly of my childhood and adolescence, which is that by 9 p.m. on election day evening, you knew who was going to run the country. This may take weeks, it may take months, and guess who will be the head of a caretaker government for all that time? It will be Angela Merkel, who will then with certainty become Germany's longest serving chancellor ever. That may be reassuring to some, terrifying to others. I can only hope that we get this sorted quickly, because again, to come back to your question, I think what Americans and our European friends and allies also should be worried about is us not getting our act together, spending a long time on internal issues, being completely inward looking at a time when Europe really needs presence on the stage from its large members, including Germany.
I think that's the least the world needs is like chaos in Germany, right? I mean, months or weeks and months.
It seems self-indulgent.
Yes, no, because it's much more, and maybe we should spend some minutes talking about why Germany matters so much in this current state of the world. But before we start that, Tyson, I will kick this question to you. I want to remember our viewership that you can participate in this conversation by asking or putting your questions in our chat. Tyson, why is Germany so important, the German government these days? You are in Brussels. I think that's a good spot to talk about that.
I mean, Germany has, under Merkel's leadership, obviously she's the longest serving leader in Europe, as well as perhaps the longest serving leader in Germany's modern history. Germany is obviously the largest economy. It's the most populated country in Europe with around 82 million citizens. It is seen as the strongest economy and a real leader when it comes to fiscal and economic policy in Europe. Without Germany, European economic policy doesn't move. And we saw in the COVID crisis a move towards centralizing some forms of stimulus and recovery in the form of the Next Generation EU Pact, which is, by the way, being implemented under the Commission leadership of Ursula von der Leyen, a protege of Angela Merkel, who has served many years in her governments in many functions. It's hard to imagine a European Union without a strong German role. And for the first time in 15 years, that role is not going to be inhabited by Angela Merkel, who has shaped everything from repackaging the European Constitution in the form of the Lisbon Treaty to setting the stage for managing the Eurozone crisis with the establishment of the European Stability Mechanism, and dealing with Greece and other countries that were struggling, to the migration crisis, to holding the line, very important for Americans, on sanctions on Russia in response to Russia's actions in Ukraine. Migration crisis, the EU-Turkey deal was essentially something that was negotiated and operated from Berlin. So Germany is just immensely important for how Europe works, and by proxy for how Europe works in the world. I think that there's going to be a lot of assurance, both in Washington and in Germany, that Merkel is the leader of the caretaker government. I think people will have the feeling, because she is such a steady hand, that means that although there's uncertainty, that there isn't chaos and instability. She's a trusted veteran in German politics. And that might even give more time to what Constanze pointed to, which is maybe they won't have the pressure and urgency to negotiate a coalition agreement quickly. So that could be actually problematic, ironically. Germany is taking over the presidency of the G7 next year. So this new government is going to have to set an agenda on the international stage, building the plane while flying it. And an issue that I work on, which is tech policy, there's the expectation that there's going to be a new digital ministry, which would need to have an international identity. But of course, they're not going to have a staff. They're not going to have a structure. It's going to be having to hit the ground running. And just looking at the G7 presidency is one data point that shows how acutely important it is that Germany gets the government quickly and gets it right. I would also say it might not even, although the instinct of the individual will matter who's chancellor, obviously, if it's Laschet or Scholz, the composition of the government will be extremely important. And I can just think of some of the personalities that could inhabit the finance ministry and the economic ministry and see a wide spectrum from a very kind of liberal policy with a economic minister Merz and a finance minister Lindner, which would look very different from a government in a red-red-green coalition, which we see as very unlikely. So the orientation of the next government really spans the spectrum, and I think that is where the uncertainty lies.
Thank you. Very important. I think, Constanze, we have to spend a couple of minutes on Afghanistan and the speech that Joe Biden delivered yesterday. He was kind of declaring a new era, that the time when big military actions are kind of conducted by the United States is over. That also means that kind of Europe finally maybe should get its act together. Which role does Germany play in that regard? And again, what would it mean if it would take weeks, if not months, to build a government in this crucial period?
Well, we could spend hours on this subject alone, because it raises such a plethora of issues. Right now, I mean, I don't know whether anybody noticed, Merkel yesterday, I think, said in a speech, I was traveling back from a one-week beach vacation, so I was listening to Deutschlandfunk on the way. But I gather Merkel said that we were looking at 10 to 40,000 so-called Ortskräfte, Afghans who had worked with the German forces, German civilian representations, or development and humanitarian aid organizations that we would need to support. Notably, she didn't say all of them have to come to Germany, or we will bring all of them to Germany. And yesterday there was an EU, I think, interior ministers meeting that basically said in unison, we don't want any Afghans in Europe. I'm exaggerating slightly, but that's what it sounded like. We don't know yet what's going to happen on the immigration front, because I think that depends on decisions made not just by ordinary Afghans in Afghanistan, but also on the behavior of the Taliban and on the West's ability to make it clear to the Taliban that no development aid, no humanitarian aid will be forthcoming if they mistreat their own population. That said, I think command and control of Taliban leaders over their sort of militia elements, is pretty notional. So this is all, I think, completely unpredictable. But we, I think, all know that the AfD would be absolutely thrilled if there were a new immigration crisis that it could attempt to exploit, because the AfD, in many ways, has painted itself into a corner politically. It's become so overtly radical that the German domestic intelligence service is, on the brink of putting it under surveillance as in its totality. And so the AfD really needs to break out of the poll doldrums of about 10% where it is right now. That's one point. The other aspect of the Afghanistan debacle that it raises, of course, is transatlantic relations. And the EU's ability to develop, or Europe's ability to develop anything remotely like a European pillar within the alliance or on its own, what is normally called strategic autonomy. And I think it was Kans Kunani who was saying on Twitter yesterday that the problem about strategic autonomy is that it means other Europeans accepting a leading role by what are now the big two rather than the big three in Europe, which is France and or Germany. In other words, France and Germany would have to be to Europe what the Americans are in NATO. And there are many Europeans for whom this is problematic. That is, I think he was perfectly right in saying that is the key problem with strategic autonomy. That said, I think the President Biden, has made it absolutely clear that we need to look to ourselves in our own neighborhood And that neighborhood, I think now, is much larger than it used to be. It's not just Belarus, which is problematic enough, or Ukraine, difficult enough. Not just Northern Africa, but our neighborhood stretches all the way to Afghanistan. And I think that is going to have to be a huge topic for the next government. And I'm, a lot of the so-called strategic communities, to which I suppose Tyson and I belong in some ways, have been saying it's time to wake up and understand realities here. But based on current polling, based on the current political debate, this is going to be very, very hard. So Afghanistan's going to be with us for a while.
We're saying that since years, right? That Europe has to wake up.
Yeah.
And I mean, how much louder could a wake up call be? Tyson, we have many questions, and I really would like, as we have only 10 minutes, and this is just the beginning of the series, and there will be many more discussions to be followed here at the Atlantic Council over the next weeks. But I just want to bring in a question. I will address it to you, Tyson, from Mark Sashin. He asks, how do the candidates view China? Is there a wide divergence, or do all candidates have the same view? He also asks the same question about Russia.
Well, starting with China, I mean, it's just tagging on to what Constanze said. You know, there used to be a saying that Germany's defense began at the Hindu Kush. And the question is that mentality still present in Germany after this withdrawal, this somewhat chaotic withdrawal, which I think also shook a norm of the alliance, which was in together, out together. And that is something that is reflected in Berlin. And I think that will be absorbed in the next government. On China, Constanze will have opinions of this as well. I see the position in Germany hardening. And that's across the board. I think that for a candidate like Laschet, his instinct as a minister president in NRW, which the North Rhine-Westphalia, which has a lot of economic equities and trade equities related to China, his instinct would be to be more stability-minded and focus on the trade aspect to the point of being perhaps accommodationist. But the political environment and what is happening in China is really pushing him to harden his position. The Greens have been very strident about pointing out the surveillance state that exists in China, that pointing out the genocide that's taking place in Xinjiang, the human rights violations and abuses in Hong Kong, anything related to dual use exports to China, the economic relationship, the investment of 5G, the acquisition of network equipment from Chinese providers, and the security risks involved. I mean, Merkel herself, I think her formative period, she kind of formed her position on China in like 2012, something like that, kind of after the financial crisis, when there was a massive dip in German exports, and the China-German role as the kind of two current account surplus countries were kind of kindred spirits in some ways in global economic governance around 2010. And I think that's kind of stuck with her a little bit. Plus, she listens to German industry, particularly the auto industry. Now, I know people will point to BDI, the German Chamber of Commerce, and say, well, they've hardened their position, which is true. But the BDI is not as influential in international policy as it is in domestic policy. But all three have become more hardened. That said, I think it's going to be iterative and complex. It's not going to be one for one with a US position or a Swedish position. Those equities are going to remain. And the transformation of German industry from something that is precision-based manufacturing to something that's going to have to be systems-based Internet of Things is going to mean redefining a relationship with one of its largest markets, which is China. So I think that even though the positions are hardening, that is a relationship that is going to have to remain, and that's going to have to be an open discourse between Germany and China. And that's how it's seen domestically. One more thing on the human rights violations in China. They're all very theoretical for the German population. It's very similar to what happened in Ukraine. Ukraine in 2014, public opinion didn't really start to move. I mean, of course, there was a lot of sympathy for the Ukrainian people, but it only really started to move after the shoot down of MH17, which had Dutch, German, and other EU citizens. That's when the public became aware of the immediacy of the security threat. And right now, the things that are happening within China's borders and in China's neighborhood are just not, they don't have an immediate impact on Germans' lives. I'll stop there.
Constanze.
Yes?
Do you want to add something to that?
Not given the time.
Not given the time.
Questions.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so there are many, many questions about Afghanistan, but I think we talked about that. Or do you want to add something? People ask, which role does the debacle, the disaster, the situation in Afghanistan will play during the next weeks? I mean, I think we discussed about that. Or does one of you guys have another thought about that?
Yeah, I would like to make one point, which is I think people should not underestimate the degree to which sort of the failure, or what is now being seen as the complete and total failure, which I don't think is right, of this mission will undermine the transatlantic alliance. And I don't mean just in the sense of narratives of legitimacy, because this was the only Article 5 mission. And I remember very well, because I was a site reporter at the time, it was the Europeans pushing the Americans to let us invoke Article 5. And the Bush administration didn't want us to. We pushed on September 12th. There's another point here, and it's a point that I've just made in my FT column. It's worth reinforcing, because people don't get that. No generation of policymakers, politicians, civil servants, soldiers, officers, humanitarian aid workers, development aid people, and media have had their working lives, their biographies so intertwined with this mission. So the reason why so many of us in the past 2 weeks have been scrambling to help getting people out is that we know people and they know us. It's personal. This isn't an abstraction. And maybe it's an abstraction for the 80 million Germans, but it is not an abstraction for the biggest number of people working in foreign and security policy ever in the post-war history of this country. Yeah. And because we all have cell phones and social media, and because our Afghan acquaintances are on that, that makes an enormous difference. And I say that from some personal experience of the past 2 weeks.
But what does that mean for the elections? Will this kind of shape the opinion of voters? Will this change the minds
I'm
of
not
voters?
sure it means anything for the elections, but it means something for the commitment of the foreign and security policy elites to missions like this and to the alliance. And again, none of this is to say that no mistakes were made. None of this is to say that there wasn't hubris, hypocrisy, hypertrophic sort of mission creep and all that. Guilty as charged. But I want to say that hundreds and thousands of people, in Germany, 150,000 soldiers alone, went through this mission and decided to commit to it, put their lives on the line, spent years there working. And for this, retroactively, to be depicted as a complete and utter waste of time, will have an impact not just on the morale of armed forces, but also on their relationships with politics and with civil society. And we should be very careful about that.
Can I add one thing to that? I know you got to close out, but I just want to say.
No, I have 5 more minutes. So.
Oh, okay. It's very important to note that the respect and the perception of the German armed forces has really, the esteem that the German people have for the armed forces has never been higher, I think, in post-war history. And that is because of the appreciation for the sacrifice that the German armed forces made. It's very present in German society right now. And that is a big change. The awareness that Germany has veterans. Germany has a veteran community that needs to be taken care of. Discussions about PTSD are happening in Germany now. That has not been the case even 10 years ago. when Germany also had veterans, because they were also participating in the ISAF mission. So that, as Constanze said, there's a lot to process in this withdrawal, but a very small sign of good impact in Germany is the appreciation for the sacrifices that Germans themselves have made in this case, and their Afghan colleagues on the front lines.
Thank you. I have one last question to you guys before we have to close, unfortunately. Our viewers are asking which role the AfD is playing this time in this election. Tyson?
I'm going to highlight two things. One is three things. One, Constanze already touched on, which is if there is a migration and refugee issue, that's something that they'll try to capitalize on. The second is the areas of strength the AfD has. It has a ceiling, as we've seen. It's this 10%, but it has strengths in certain communities. One is the German-Russian community, which is one of the reasons why they publish in Russian. So they try to appeal to the 2 million Germans who immigrated from the post-Soviet space, who have some affinity to the AfD. They also have strengths among young voters, and I think this is very important, very different from the United States, young voters in Germany's East. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But if you look at the voting in state elections, in Saxony-Anhalt, in Saxony, in Brandenburg, if it weren't for voters over 60, the AfD would be the #1 party in all three. So they are a strong party among the youth of areas that feel like they're not being paid attention to by the elites in cities. And it's not the same phenomenon as the Trump phenomenon, because the demography looks different. So I think that's definitely something we should pay attention to. So those are the two issues I wanted to raise.
Do they have the power to really kind of set the agenda or influence the agenda as they had like 4 or 5 years ago, Constanze?
I think based on the current state of play, no. But again, this has been a whiplash election. We've seen, several what seems like solid predictions completely overturned. So I'm not betting anything on that one. But let's also mention something that we haven't touched on so far, which is the fact that all of the parties have a non-cooperation policy with the AfD. Obviously, the party for whom that is most important, and the only party for whom it's really relevant, is the CDU. And the CDU has had problems on the local and regional level with this for years. Remember that AKK had to step down as party leader, and I think did so in order to prevent Merkel herself being brought down, because an unknown liberal politician was elected minister president of Thuringia 2 years ago. With the help of the AfD and the toleration of the CDU. This was a horrific experience for the CDU leadership in Berlin, which had been proved unable to prevent it. That's why AKK stepped down. So there is always a worry that on the sort of local and regional level, the AfD will try to make inroads into the Stammwählerschaft, the base of the CDU. But in reality, because there are no coalition option for it, what it has to do if it wants to have power on the national level is to follow what UKIP and the Brexit Party did, which is to tunnel into the large Conservative Party. And arguably, the Tory Party in the UK now is a much more right-wing entity than it was, say, 5 or 10 years ago. So that's the point of the Werteunion, which is a small and non-recognized hard right element in the CDU, being run by somebody like Max Otte, who has publicly expressed his sympathy for the AfD, and fielding its most notorious candidate in the form of Hans-Georg Maaßen, the former head of the Domestic Intelligence Service in a district in Thuringia. Now, the Werteunion lost a lot of members when it elected Max Otte. So this is highly controversial. But I think what people should look for very carefully is sort of these AfD strategies of trying to sort of co-opt or tunnel into the uncovered right wing of the Conservative Party, the CDU.
Thank you. Dear viewers, I think that was the proof that it can't get any more exciting. So I really encourage you to follow #GermanyVotes and the series by the Atlantic Council over the next days and weeks. Please recommend this recording, and I think it's actually worth watching again. I will do so. Thank you so much, Tyson. It was wonderful to get your insights. Constanze, always great meeting you. Jan, thank you for having us, and yeah, we shall see. See you soon. Bye-bye. Auf Wiedersehen.
Cheers. Bye-bye. Thanks for having me on.